There's a house in northern Alabama that no one talks about anymore. It sits on a dirt road that doesn't appear on modern maps, surrounded by pines so thick the sunlight barely touches the ground. The locals who remember it, and there aren't many left, they'll change the subject if you ask. They'll look away, they'll tell you some stories aren't meant to be told. But I found the records, court documents, census data, hospital reports that were sealed for 70 years, and what I discovered was a family tree that didn't branch outward like it should. It twisted back on itself, again and again and again. His name was Silas Grimwood, and between 1920 and 1958 he married 3 women. All of them were his blood relatives, all of them bore his children, and all of them are buried in unmarked graves on land that's been abandoned since 1959. This isn't folklore. This isn't an urban legend whispered around campfires. This is documented history that someone tried very hard to erase, and tonight you're going to hear it all. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. The story of Silas Grimwood begins in 1898, in a valley so remote that when the first census taker arrived in 1900, he marked it on his map as unincorporated wilderness. Silas was born the eldest of 9 children to a family that had lived in those hills for 3 generations, ever since his great-grandfather fled Georgia after the Civil War. They didn't trust outsiders, they didn't want government interference, and most importantly, they believed that bloodlines were meant to stay pure. By the time Silas turned 22, he stood 6 feet tall, with pale eyes that people said could look right through you. He rarely spoke, he never smiled. And according to a neighbor who was interviewed in 1962, he had a way of making you feel like you'd done something wrong just by being in the same room. But what no one knew yet, what wouldn't be uncovered for another 40 years, was that Silas had already begun planning something that would make his family name synonymous with a nightmare. The first marriage happened in the winter of 1920. Silas was 22 years old, his bride was 18, her name was Ruth Grimwood, and she was his first cousin. In the isolated valleys of northern Alabama, this wasn't uncommon. Families had been intermarrying for generations, partly out of necessity, there simply weren't many people, and partly out of ideology. The Grimwoods believed, as many insular communities did, that marrying within the family kept the land together, kept the bloodline strong, and kept outsiders from diluting what they saw as their heritage. But what made Silas different was the intention behind it. According to a diary found in the ruins of the family home in 1973, Ruth didn't want to marry him. She'd tried to leave twice before the wedding. Both times, she was brought back by her father and Silas's father, who were brothers. The diary entry from 3 days before the ceremony reads, "They say it's God's will. They say I don't have a choice. Silas watches me through the window at night. I can feel him even when I can't see him." The wedding took place in the family's barn. No preacher, no official record, just a gathering of relatives who stood in a circle while Silas's father read from a Bible and declared them man and wife. Ruth wore a dress that had belonged to her dead grandmother. Silas wore his father's Sunday clothes, and when it was over, he took her by the arm and led her to a cabin he'd built on the far edge of the property, nearly a mile from the main house. That cabin still stands today, or what's left of it. I've seen photographs. The walls are rotted through. The roof has collapsed. But if you look closely at the door frame, you can still see the gouges in the wood, long, deep scratches that run from the inside, as if someone had clawed at the door trying to get out. Ruth gave birth to her first child in 1921, a girl. She was born with a cleft palate and webbed fingers on her left hand, early signs of what happens when bloodlines converge too closely. The baby died before she was a year old. Ruth buried her herself in a plot behind the cabin because Silas refused to let her take the body to town for a proper funeral. Over the next 6 years, Ruth had 3 more children, 2 boys and another girl. All of them showed signs of genetic abnormalities. One boy never learned to speak. The other had seizures that would leave him unconscious for hours. The girl was born with her legs twisted inward, unable to walk without support. And through it all, Silas kept Ruth isolated. She was rarely seen in town. When she was, neighbors later recalled that she looked haunted, that she moved like someone in a trance, and that she never made eye contact. One woman, interviewed in 1968, said, "I tried to talk to her once at the general store, asked her how she was doing. She just stared at me and whispered, 'He's listening.' Then she walked away." By 1928, Ruth was 26 years old. She looked 50, and then, on a cold morning in November, she disappeared. The official story, the one Silas told anyone who asked, was that Ruth had run off, left in the middle of the night, took nothing with her, just vanished into the woods like a ghost. But the children told a different story, not in words. Most of them couldn't speak clearly enough to be understood, but in the way they flinched when their father entered a room, in the way they huddled together in corners, in the way the oldest boy, Thomas, who was 6 at the time, would wake up screaming in the night, crying for his mother. A neighbor named Earl Hutchins later testified that he'd heard gunshots coming from the Grimwood property the night Ruth disappeared. Single shot. Then silence. When he asked Silas about it the next day, Silas looked at him with those pale, empty eyes and said, "Coyote in the henhouse. Had to put it down." No one investigated. There was no sheriff who patrolled that far into the hills. No one filed a missing person report. Ruth's own family, her parents, her siblings, they didn't ask questions. They didn't come looking for her. Years later, when investigators finally started piecing together what had happened, Ruth's younger sister admitted, "We knew. We all knew. But you didn't cross Silas. You didn't ask him questions. You just prayed it wouldn't be you next." For 2 years after Ruth vanished, Silas lived alone with the children in that cabin. He didn't hire help. He didn't remarry. He simply existed, day after day, working the land, barely feeding the children, barely acknowledging they were there. Then in 1930 something changed. Silas started going to town more often, started attending church services, which he'd never done before, started making himself visible, almost sociable. People noticed, they whispered about it, and then they understood why. He was looking for a new wife. But here's where the story takes an even darker turn, because Silas wasn't looking outside the family, he was looking within it. Specifically, he was looking at his younger sister, a girl named Mary, who had just turned 17. Mary had grown up watching Ruth's decline from a distance. She'd seen her brother's cold, controlling nature. She'd heard the rumors about what happened to Ruth, though no one dared speak them aloud. And when Silas approached their father with a proposal to marry Mary, she begged. According to a letter she wrote to a friend that was discovered decades later, she begged her father to refuse. But he didn't refuse. In fact, he agreed almost immediately. The reasoning, as explained in family letters that survived, was simple. The land had to stay in the family. Silas controlled most of it now, and if Mary married him, her inheritance would fold into his. It was a transaction, a business arrangement. The fact that they were brother and sister was, in the minds of these people, less important than keeping the Grimwood name intact. In June of 1930, Silas Grimwood married his own sister in the same barn where he'd married Ruth 10 years earlier. Mary wore white, Silas wore black, and the children from his first marriage stood in the corner, silent and staring, as their father took his own blood sister as his wife. Mary moved into the cabin where Ruth had lived, where Ruth had clawed at the door, where Ruth had buried her firstborn behind the house, and from the very beginning she knew she'd made a terrible mistake. Silas treated Mary differently than he'd treated Ruth, not better, just different. Where Ruth had been kept isolated and silent, Mary was kept compliant through fear. Silas had learned from his first marriage. He'd learned that isolation bred desperation, and desperation could lead to escape attempts. So instead, he controlled Mary through psychological torment. He would disappear for days without explanation, leaving her alone with Ruth's damaged children, then return and accuse her of disloyalty. He would wake her in the middle of the night to interrogate her about her thoughts, her feelings, whether she'd spoken to anyone in town. A journal entry from one of Mary's childhood friends written in 1947 recalls, "Mary came to see me once, maybe 3 months after the wedding. She'd lost weight. Her hands wouldn't stop shaking. She kept looking over her shoulder like someone was following her. I asked if she was all right, and she said, 'He knows everything. Even when he's not there, he knows.' I never saw her again after that day." Mary became pregnant within the first year of marriage. The baby, a boy, was born in 1931 with a severely malformed skull and lived only 3 days. Silas buried him without ceremony in the same plot where Ruth's children lay. Mary wasn't allowed to attend. She wasn't allowed to grieve. Silas told her it was God's punishment for her weakness, for her doubts, for her failure to fully submit to his authority. Over the next 8 years, Mary had 5 more children. Each one bore the unmistakable markers of inbreeding: intellectual disabilities, physical deformities, chronic illnesses that doctors in town couldn't explain because Mary was never allowed to tell them the truth about her relationship to her children's father. One child was born blind. Another had a heart defect that left him gasping for air with any physical exertion. A daughter had skeletal abnormalities so severe she couldn't stand upright. But Mary endured. She had no choice. Her family had abandoned her. The community either didn't know or didn't care, and Silas had made it clear, in ways both spoken and unspoken, that if she tried to leave, she would end up like Ruth. Then, in 1938, something extraordinary happened. Mary found Ruth. Not alive. Ruth had been dead for a decade by then. But Mary found where Silas had buried her. Behind the cabin, beneath a stand of oak trees, there was a depression in the earth that Mary had always been forbidden to approach. One afternoon, while Silas was in town, Mary took a shovel and started digging. 3 feet down, she found fabric. 4 feet down, she found bones. And wrapped around one of the finger bones was a ring, Ruth's wedding ring, the one Mary remembered from childhood. Mary didn't tell anyone what she'd found. She couldn't. But from that moment on, according to notes taken by a psychiatrist who evaluated her years later, Mary began planning. She began hoarding small amounts of money. She began memorizing the schedule of buses that ran through the nearest town. She began very quietly and very carefully preparing to run. She never got the chance. In the spring of 1939, Mary became pregnant again, and this time, something in her broke. She stopped eating, stopped speaking. According to Silas's own testimony, given decades later under very different circumstances, Mary spent the last 3 months of her pregnancy sitting in a rocking chair by the window, staring out at the woods, humming the same song over and over again, a lullaby her mother used to sing. The baby was born in August, a girl. She appeared healthy at first, which was unusual. But Mary took one look at the child, handed her to Silas and said, "This one's yours. I'm done." 3 days later, Mary Grimwood walked into the woods behind the cabin and never came back. Silas claimed she'd abandoned the family, but the truth that wouldn't come out until much later, was far worse. When Mary disappeared, Silas didn't report it. He didn't organize a search party. He didn't even tell Mary's parents for nearly 2 weeks. And when he finally did, his explanation was simple, almost rehearsed. She couldn't handle being a mother. She left. Women do that sometimes. Mary's father, the same man who had given his daughter to his son in marriage, accepted this without question, or perhaps he simply chose not to question it, because questioning it would mean confronting what he'd allowed to happen, what he'd been complicit in, and that was a guilt too heavy to bear. But there was one person who didn't accept the story. Mary's younger brother James, who was only 14 when Mary married Silas, had grown into a man who'd seen enough of his family's darkness to recognize a lie when he heard one. In 1940, James went to the local sheriff, a man named Curtis Wade, and demanded an investigation. Sheriff Wade was reluctant. The Grimwoods were known in the county, not well liked but certainly feared. They kept to themselves, they didn't cause public trouble, and most importantly, they owned a lot of land. Wade knew that stirring up accusations against Silas could create problems he didn't want to deal with. But James was persistent. He brought up Ruth's disappearance 11 years earlier. He brought up the strange, damaged children that everyone had seen, but no one talked about. He brought up the fact that 2 women had now vanished from Silas Grimwood's life without a trace. Wade finally agreed to visit the property. He brought a deputy with him. They arrived on a grey October morning, unannounced, and found Silas working in the field behind the cabin. When Wade asked about Mary, Silas repeated the same story. She left. She was weak. She couldn't handle her responsibilities. Wade asked to search the property. Silas refused. Wade pressed the issue. Silas, according to the deputy's report filed that day, smiled for the first time anyone could remember and said, "You need a warrant for that, Sheriff, and you're not going to get one, because you know as well as I do that nobody cares what happens out here." He was right. Wade left empty-handed. No warrant was ever issued. No search was ever conducted. And James, Mary's brother, was told in no uncertain terms to drop the matter or face consequences. He left Alabama 3 months later and never returned. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you have stayed silent, or would you have risked everything to uncover the truth? For the next 6 years, Silas lived on that property with 9 children, 4 from Ruth, 5 from Mary. The oldest was 17. The youngest was the infant Mary had given birth to before she disappeared. Neighbors occasionally saw them in town, a strange silent procession following their father. The children never spoke. They never played. They moved like shadows, hollow-eyed and haunted. And then, in 1945, Silas took a 3rd wife. Her name was Anna. She was 19 years old, and she was his niece, the daughter of his deceased older brother. The brother who had helped drag Ruth back when she tried to escape all those years ago. Anna's mother had died in childbirth. Her father had died in a farming accident when she was 16. She had no other family except Silas. And when he came to her with a proposal of marriage, she had nowhere else to go. The pattern was repeating. Again. Anna was different from Ruth and Mary in one crucial way. She could read and write well, and she'd spent 2 years working at the county clerk's office before her father died. She understood records, she understood documentation, and more importantly, she understood that what Silas was doing wasn't just morally wrong, it was illegal, even by the loose standards of rural Alabama in the 1940s. But she was also alone, destitute, and living in a time when a woman without family had almost no options. So in the spring of 1945, Anna became the 3rd Mrs. Grimwood. No official marriage license was ever filed. Like the marriages before, it was a private ceremony conducted by Silas himself, with only the damaged children as witnesses. Anna moved into the cabin that had claimed 2 women before her, and within weeks she began to understand the full horror of what she'd entered into. The children were more than neglected. They were traumatized. Some of them had never been taught to speak properly. Others showed signs of severe physical and psychological abuse. The oldest boy, Thomas, now 23 years old, could barely function. He would rock back and forth for hours, whispering his dead mother's name. But Anna did something that Ruth and Mary either couldn't or wouldn't do. She started keeping a record. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the cabin, she kept a journal where she documented everything. Silas's behavior, the children's conditions, the places on the property where the earth looked disturbed, the nights when Silas would disappear into the woods with a shovel and return hours later with dirt under his fingernails. One entry, dated July 1946, reads, "Found bones today, small ones, wrapped in cloth behind the barn. Asked Silas about them. He said they were animal bones, but they're not. I know what a child's ribcage looks like. I worked in the clerk's office. I fills death certificates. These are children, his children, the ones who didn't survive, the ones he never reported." Anna became pregnant in late 1945. She tried to hide it at first, tried to induce a miscarriage using methods she'd heard whispered about by women in town. But Silas knew, he always knew, and he told her in his cold, emotionless way that if she harmed his child, he would make sure she never had the opportunity to harm another. The baby was born in August 1946, a boy. He had a cleft lip and clubbed feet, but he was alive, and he was breathing. Anna named him Samuel after her father. Silas never called him by name, he only referred to him as the boy or it. Over the next 3 years, Anna had 2 more children. Both showed the telltale signs, developmental delays, physical abnormalities, the genetic catastrophes that occur when family trees collapse inward on themselves. And with each birth, Anna's journal entries became more desperate, more detailed, and more determined. She was building a case, she was documenting evidence, and she was waiting for an opportunity. That opportunity came in 1952 when Silas suffered a stroke. It wasn't severe enough to kill him, but it left him weakened, partially paralyzed on his left side, and for the first time in 30 years, vulnerable. Anna saw her chance. She gathered her 3 youngest children. The oldest ones from Ruth and Mary were adults now, too damaged and too conditioned to leave, and she fled. She made it to town. She went directly to the sheriff's office, but Sheriff Wade had retired years earlier, and the new sheriff, a man named Donald Price, had heard the stories about the Grimwood family. He'd heard the whispers, and when Anna came in, wild-eyed and trembling, with 3 obviously disabled children and a tale about incest, murder, and buried bodies, Sheriff Price made a decision. He didn't believe her, or rather, he chose not to believe her, because believing her would mean opening an investigation that would implicate not just Silas, but the entire community that had turned a blind eye for decades. It would mean exhuming bodies. It would mean testifying in court about things people wanted to forget. So Sheriff Price called Silas. He told him his wife had run off with some wild accusations, and he told him to come collect his family. Anna begged. She screamed. She showed him her journal, but Price handed her back to Silas anyway, along with her children, and told her that if she ever made such accusations again, she'd be committed to the state asylum for hysteria. Silas took Anna home, and 2 weeks later, Anna disappeared, just like Ruth, just like Mary, gone without a trace. For 7 years after Anna vanished, Silas Grimwood lived alone on that property with the children who remained, the ones too broken to leave, too conditioned to question. He was in his 60s now, his health failing, his body deteriorating from the stroke, but his control never wavered. The children, now adults themselves, cared for him, fed him, bathed him, obeyed him without question, even as he wasted away in the same cabin where 3 women had disappeared. Silas died in the winter of 1959. He was 61 years old. There was no funeral, no obituary. The children buried him themselves on the property, in an unmarked grave, and then something extraordinary happened. They scattered. Within a month, every single one of them had left. The property sat abandoned. The cabin stood empty, and for 15 years, the story of Silas Grimwood faded into local legend, the kind of tale people told in hushed voices, but never too loudly. Then, in 1974, a developer purchased the land. He planned to clear it, subdivide it, turn it into residential lots, but when his crew started surveying the property, they found something that brought everything to a halt. Behind the cabin, beneath the oak trees, they found graves. Not 1 or 2, but 7, shallow graves, unmarked, some containing remains that had been there for decades. The police were called, forensic teams arrived, and over the course of 6 weeks, they exhumed 7 bodies from the Grimwood property. 3 were adults, 4 were children, ranging in age from infant to approximately 8 years old. Dental records and bone analysis eventually identified two of the adults, Ruth Grimwood, who had been reported missing in 1928, and Mary Grimwood, missing since 1939. The third adult remains were never positively identified, but DNA testing conducted years later confirmed they were female, approximately 20 to 30 years old, at time of death, and consistent with Anna's age and timeline. The children's remains told an even darker story. All four showed signs of severe genetic abnormalities, fused bones, malformed skulls, evidence of conditions that would have made survival beyond infancy nearly impossible. These were the children who hadn't made it. The ones Silas had buried in secret rather than report their deaths. The ones he'd hidden because their very existence was evidence of what he'd done. But here's what haunts me most about this case. When investigators finally tracked down the surviving children, the ones who'd fled in 1959, not a single one would testify. Not one would confirm what had happened. Thomas, the eldest, who was 52 years old by then, told investigators, "My father did what he thought was right. It's not for me to judge him." Another sibling simply said, "The past is buried. Leave it buried." The conditioning ran so deep, the trauma so complete, that even decades later, even after they were free, they couldn't bring themselves to condemn him. Or perhaps they were protecting themselves from the shame, from the judgment, from the realization that they were the products of something unspeakable. No charges were ever filed. Silas was dead. The statute of limitations on any crime he might have committed had long since expired, and the legal system of 1974 had no framework for prosecuting a dead man for crimes that the community had tacitly allowed for 30 years. The property was seized by the county for unpaid taxes. The cabin was demolished in 1976. Today, the land is part of a state forest. There's a hiking trail that runs through it. People walk past the spot where that cabin stood every day, completely unaware of what happened there. There's no historical marker. No memorial, nothing to indicate that this quiet stretch of Alabama wilderness was once the site of one of the most disturbing family horror stories in American history. I visited the site last year, stood where the cabin would have been, walked back to where the graves were found, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the story isn't really over, because somewhere out there are descendants of Silas Grimwood, children and grandchildren of his victims who carry his DNA, who carry the genetic consequences of what he did, and who may have no idea about the darkness in their family tree. The last surviving child of Silas Grimwood died in 2003. With her death, the first-hand accounts died too, but the evidence remains. The court records, the exhumation reports, the journal Anna kept, which was eventually recovered and is now stored in the Alabama State Archives, available for anyone willing to look. Some stories are buried for a reason. Some secrets are meant to stay hidden, but history has a way of surfacing. Truth has a way of clawing its way out of the ground, no matter how deep you bury it. Silas Grimwood married 3 women, all his blood relatives. He controlled them, imprisoned them, and when they tried to escape or simply couldn't endure anymore, he erased them, and for 30 years an entire community allowed it to happen. That's the real horror, not just what one man did, but what everyone else chose not to see. If this story disturbed you, good, it should. This is the history they don't teach in schools. These are the secrets buried in family Bibles and sealed court records. And there are more stories like this, hundreds of them, thousands maybe, hidden in the rural corners of America, waiting for someone to uncover them. Thank you for watching. If this story affected you, leave a comment below, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and remember, the past isn't as distant as we'd like to believe. Sometimes it's buried right beneath our feet, waiting to be found.